So in this chapter, we're going to talk about supply and demand analysis. Now, something that anybody on the street, if you ask them, just about anybody will tell you, if you ask them what's economics all about, they'll say, oh, supply and demand. Well, what does that mean? Right? How do we do that kind of analysis? Well, in order to do that, we have to build up the two sides of the market. So in this first video, we're going to start with talking about demand. Now, we start off here with our demand schedule. And what is a demand schedule? Well, it's just, as you can see here, a schedule. Right? It's got two columns. In the first column, we have the price. So what we're looking at here, and again, this follows the example from our textbook, it's the demand for bottled water. And so in this first column, we have price, right? In price per bottle of water. And so we go from $2.50 to $2, $1.50 to $1 down to 50 cents. And in the second column, we see at each price how many bottles, in this case in millions, right? How many millions of bottles of water per day consumers will want at each price, okay? And so we can take that demand schedule and we can put it into a graph. And in our demand graph, we put price up on the y-axis and quantity down on the x-axis, okay? And so we can just go ahead and plot this out. And so if I take my different prices here, just start from the bottom. I'll have all my different prices, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and we'll just go ahead and go all the way up to 8. So when price is all the way up at $2.50, consumers will only want 3 million bottles per day. It goes down to 2, consumers will want to buy more. And we just kind of plot this out and then connect the dots. Okay? And there is our demand curve for bottled water. And now notice we've given a time dimension here to our demand. We're saying this is per day. Okay? It's important to understand that when we're talking about a market, we have to think about how we're defining that market. Okay? So perhaps this is the demand for bottled water in the United States. Is that the appropriate geographic dimension to think about, or is that too broad? Those are questions that we need to think about when we're conducting an analysis, right? Do we want to think on a more local level? Does it make sense to think about it per day, per week? Okay. But we're going to take a step back from all of those very important questions and just take it as a given that we're looking at millions of bottles sold per day. Okay. And we're not really defining what that geographic scope of the market is, but it's not important at this point in time. We just want to understand the basics of the demand curve and what affects the demand curve's position in this space, in this graph. Now, first thing you should notice is that in our demand graph, right, no supply yet, in our demand graph, we're plotting price against quantity. Now, hopefully, if you take just a few moments to think about it, it'll occur to you that there should be a lot of other factors that determine how much water people want to buy on any given day. What about the temperature? What about, hey, is it the weekend and people are a lot more active, right? So they're going to want to buy more water. These are a lot of important questions that we have to think about. So how is all of that information embedded? Where is it embedded in the demand curve? Well, it affects the position, right? How far up or down is it in this space? And in subsequently, in a little bit, what we're going to talk about is what causes this demand curve to shift. So when you're looking at any given demand curve, we have what we call our ceteris paribus condition. Right? And that's a Latin term that means all other things constant. So in other words, we're holding the temperature on that day constant, whether it's a beautiful day for people to be out and be active, right? Sweating and needing to drink a lot more water. And any changes in those other factors will cause this demand curve to move. So that's the first thing I want you to pay attention to. Now, the other thing we always point out here is the fact that this demand curve is downward sloping. Right? And so what does that mean? Well, that means that as the price drops, we go from 250 to 2, all the way down to 1, and then down to 50 cents. The quantity demanded, right, the number of bottles that people will want to buy is increasing. Right? And as the price goes up, people want to buy less. We call this the law of demand. Right? Simply put, it means that as the price goes down, people want to buy more. As the price goes up, people want to buy less. So what is it that gives us this law of demand? Why is this the case? Well, we have two things that happen. We have a substitution effect and an income effect. So think of it this way. As the price of a bottle of water comes down, that bottle of water is now cheaper compared to the other things that you might want to buy, like say a coffee from Starbucks, or a bottle of Coca-Cola. Although granted, water is an ingredient in there, so there may be some relationship. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But as the price of water comes down, it makes it cheaper compared to other goods, so consumers may substitute towards water. Right? Likewise, if the price of bottled water goes up, consumers will substitute away from water towards other products, right? Coffee, soda, beer, whatever the case may be. Additionally, we have what we call the income effect. Right? As the price of water comes down, you effectively have more income now. And imagine if you were buying a case of water every week for your household and spending, it's not that expensive, $4 on that water, well, or per day. That now it's become cheaper, right? So you can buy that same amount of water and have more money left over, right? Which actually means that, well, maybe you'll want to buy even more. For something like bottled water, imagine that the income effect may not be very large, because we're not talking about an item in which we spend a large fraction of our income. Not necessarily going to be true in every society and for every population. Right? You can think about getting clean, potable water in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, right? And how bringing the cost of that water down might affect water usage, right? Especially where it makes up such a potentially a larger fraction of their household income and expenditures. But here in the United States, for most people, probably wouldn't expect a large income effect. Right? But this is what we have as our basics here. And notice one thing you should have noticed too is I've been using the term quantity demanded, not demand, but quantity demanded. Whenever we talk about moving from one point like A, which is at $2, down to, let's say, B, which is at $1, so we move from A to B, we have a change in the quantity demanded, right, from our 4 million to 6 million. Okay? When we're talking about moving along the demand curve, we refer to the resulting change in quantity as actually a change in quantity demanded. Okay? So now let's go back to the other question we had here of, well, what determines the positioning of this demand curve? And so to really help address that, we need to think about, well, what are all of the other factors that might affect demand? Okay? And so here I'll draw a new supply and demand graph. So here's our quantity, here's our price. Let's say this is our initial demand curve, D1. And now we'll draw two more. So this is D2. Now, if we talk about moving from D1 to D2, we're talking about an increase in demand. And how can you see that? Well, if you take any given price here, if you look to see where that price intersects the two demand curves, you can see that on D2, you're talking about a higher quantity. Alternatively, we also want to think about a decrease in demand. So that would be a shift from, say, D1 down to D3. Okay. And again, here, if you look at where we have the intersection between our demand curve and the price P1, you can see that at that point, the quantity demanded would be only Q3. So what might lead to these different kinds of shifts? Well, for one thing, we want to think about, say, the price of other goods. And specifically, we think about complements and substitutes. Right? So what are substitutes? Well, we already talked about some examples, right? So say the price of coffee. Right? If the price of coffee goes up, people might switch to buying more bottled water. So what is that? How would we show that in our graph here? So if we start off with D1, the price of coffee goes up, it would increase the demand for bottled water, so it would shift from D1 to D2. On the other hand, right, if the price of coffee went down, people might switch away from water to coffee, so we'd shift the demand for water down from D1 to D3. Okay. What about the price of complements? Well, so water, I don't know if it's the best example. We can think about something else, right? So what about tea and scones, right? So if the price of tea goes down, how would that affect the demand for scones? And for those of you who don't know what a scone is, that's kind of like a muffin, but a British variation on it. So if you start off with D1 as being the original demand for scones, then when the price of tea falls, people are going to buy more tea, and they may demand more scones to go along with that tea, so that would increase demand. Some other very important factors that affect demand: income. Now here we make a distinction between normal versus what we call inferior goods. A normal good is a good such that when your income goes up, you tend to want to buy more of it. Okay? So if we look at all of our consumers in this market, all the people who buy, we're talking about bottled water or any other good, right? So think about something like food. Now, food's kind of a broad category. So what about steak? Okay? What happens to the demand for steak as we become wealthier, right? Or red meat in general? Well, and what we've seen historically is that as societies became wealthier, demand for red meat increased, right? Because it was a normal good. Contrast that with what we call an inferior good, right? And that is a good where as income rises, you actually buy less of that good. Some examples historically have been things like ramen noodles, right? So when you're poor, you might eat a lot of ramen noodles, and as you become wealthier, you switch away from ramen noodles towards buying other goods, right? You substitute away towards those other normal or sometimes luxury goods. Other important factors: population. Right? If the population increases, the size of the market increases, that would cause, again, your demand curve to shift out from D1 to D2. And then future prices. A great example of the importance of future prices is to think about something like gasoline. Right? Now, we know that on average, gasoline prices tend to be lower earlier in the week. Right? In particular, over the last few years, if you look around the country, the day with the lowest price on average has tended to be Monday. So what does that mean? If you know that prices are lower on Monday and, say, Tuesday, and then as you're going into the weekend, they go up, say, Thursday, Friday. So if you're sitting there on Monday and you're looking at maybe you've got half a tank full of gas, so you could wait a few days. On the other hand, if you know that the price of gasoline is going to go up, say, 10 or 15 cents between Monday and Thursday, you might go ahead and pull that demand up, right? You might demand more gasoline today because you're expecting the price to go up in the future. Another very good contemporaneous example we have is housing prices, right? Because we've had a real constraint on new new supply of housing, and because interest rates are going up, the true cost of buying a house has been going up. So if you're thinking about buying a house, you may decide to do that now rather than waiting a couple of years if you're expecting those prices to go up. Okay? But these are, right, when we talked about all those ceteris paribus conditions, this is what we're talking about. All these other factors are being held constant whenever we're talking about any particular demand curve. Next, we're going to switch focus and talk about supply.